It was a peaceful Sunday in Greenfield Park, Ohio, a scene so familiar to anyone who'd ever spent a day in the warmth of a suburban afternoon. Families dotted the landscape, gathering around picnic tables, children's laughter echoed from the swings, and couples ambled lazily under the shelter of tall oak trees. Among the crowd was Darren, a father with a simple mission, to enjoy a quiet day with his 6-year-old daughter, Emma. Darren had packed a modest lunch, peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and lemonade in a thermos. They spread out on a faded blue blanket on the grass, the sun's rays warming the moment. Emma's animated chatter about her plans for first grade filled the air, each word a window into her world. Darren listened intently, a smile playing on his lips. His easy laugh and the way he hung on every word made Emma feel like the center of the universe. In this quiet cocoon, Darren playfully tugged at the tiny braid hanging from Emma's hair, her bright blue eyes sparkling with excitement as she proudly displayed her wobbly tooth. But amidst their shared joy, not everyone was so content. At a distance, an older woman sat alone on a bench, watching them. Darren noticed her, but only briefly. He was accustomed to stares. After all, he was a black father with a white daughter, a pairing that sometimes made people pause and stare. Sometimes, there were smiles, sometimes, there was something else. Today, it was the latter. But Darren chose to focus on Emma. As she bounced up to rush to the playground, asking if she could go, Darren chuckled and nodded, "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you." She darted off, her pink sneakers leaving little marks on the path toward the jungle gym. Darren leaned back, savoring the simple pleasure of the moment, unaware that the woman on the bench had made a phone call, one that would alter everything. The sound of Emma's laughter echoed as she climbed the jungle gym, her pink sneakers swinging with each step. Darren kept his watchful eye on her, knowing that the world wasn't always kind to families like theirs. The woman, now standing, had finished her call and was striding toward the playground. Her steps were deliberate, her face set with an expression Darren had encountered many times before, an expression that masqueraded as concern but was underpinned with judgment. She halted near the jungle gym, her voice cutting through the laughter and chatter of children. "Excuse me," she said, directing her words at Emma. "Where's your mommy?" Emma paused, gripping the metal bar tightly. "I'm here with my dad," she replied innocently, pointing toward Darren. He was already on his feet, taking slow steps toward the scene, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Is there a problem?" Darren's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of the situation. The woman turned toward him, her eyes scanning him with a barely concealed skepticism. "I was just checking," she said, her voice dripping with an edge of condescension. "You don't look related." Darren's patience began to fray. "She's my daughter," he said flatly. Emma, sensing the shift in the air, quickly climbed down from the jungle gym and rushed to his side, clutching his hand tightly. The woman, unrelenting, crossed her arms. "Well, you can't be too careful these days," she muttered, glancing at Emma as though she were searching for a sign of distress. Darren knelt down to Emma's level, his voice soft as he spoke to her. "Why don't you grab your water bottle, sweetheart? I'll be right here." Emma nodded, her small face shadowed by confusion, and made her way back toward the blanket. The woman, arms still crossed, wasn't finished. "You can understand why this looks unusual," she said, lowering her voice as if to share a secret. "A man like you, with a child like her." Darren's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. "A father spending time with his daughter shouldn't look unusual," he replied, his tone even, his composure unwavering despite the surge of anger bubbling beneath the surface. Before the exchange could continue, the sound of sirens sliced through the park's peaceful hum. Darren's heart sank. The woman's eyes flicked toward the parking lot, and a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. He knew what was coming. The sirens grew louder, drawing the attention of everyone in the park. Conversations hushed, parents pulled their children closer, and the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights began to strobe against the green of the park. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop near the playground. Darren, still standing his ground, remained calm, though his guard was up. Emma sat frozen on the blanket, clutching her water bottle, her eyes bouncing nervously between her father and the flashing lights. 2 officers stepped out, one man, one woman, both with professional but serious expressions. The woman who had made the call immediately approached them, gesturing toward Darren with urgency in her manner. Darren's pulse quickened, but he held his breath, reminding himself that he needed to stay calm for Emma's sake. The male officer approached him first, his hand resting lightly on his utility belt. "Sir, "Can we have a word?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. The female officer remained slightly behind, scanning the park, her eyes searching for something, anything, that might confirm the suspicion in the woman's demeanor. "Of course," Darren replied, his voice steady. He glanced at Emma, giving her a reassuring nod. She didn't move, but her tiny hands gripped the bottle tightly, as if it were her only anchor. The officer's questions came rapid-fire, probing into Darren's life, testing his patience with each word. "What's your name? What are you doing here? Who's the child?" Each question was met with a calm response. "She's my daughter," Darren said firmly. "Her name is Emma. We come here every weekend." The officer exchanged a look with the woman, who was still animatedly speaking with the female officer. "We received a call about a possible abduction," he said, his tone skeptical. "The caller said the child doesn't appear to be related to you." Darren's chest tightened, but he refused to let his frustration take over. "She's adopted," he explained, his voice controlled. "We've been a family since the day she was born. There's no story here. Just a father spending time with his daughter." Emma, sensing the tension, stood up and walked over to Darren. "Daddy," she whispered softly, her voice trembling. The officer glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly. But before the air could settle, the woman's voice cut through again. "Just check his story," she insisted, her tone rising, insistent, demanding. "You can't be too careful." The female officer stepped forward, her voice now neutral. "We'll need some identification, sir," she said, her tone professional. Darren nodded, his movements deliberate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "This is my driver's license," he said, handing it over. He then reached into his bag, retrieving a folded document. "And this is a copy of Emma's adoption paperwork." The officers exchanged a glance, silently reviewing the documents. Meanwhile, the woman stood to the side, arms crossed, her expression triumphant. Darren's focus remained entirely on Emma, who had clung to his leg, her small body trembling as if she could sense the quiet storm brewing around them. But Darren knew this moment would pass. Truth would prevail. And no matter what, he would always stand by his daughter. The female officer unfolded the adoption papers with meticulous care, her eyes scanning the document with precision. Her partner stood nearby, verifying Darren's ID, while time seemed to slow, stretching the seconds into what felt like an eternity. Darren stood still, his heart racing, yet his face remained a mask of composure. Beside him, Emma, her tiny fingers gripping his leg, whispered in a voice barely above a breath, "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" He crouched down, gently smoothing the hair from her face. His voice was soft, comforting. "No, sweetheart," he reassured her. "We're not in trouble." After what felt like an agonizing pause, the female officer finally lifted her gaze from the paperwork and met Darren's eyes. There was a shift in her demeanor, what had been a wall of professionalism now softened into something more empathetic. "Everything checks out," she confirmed, handing the documents back to him. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Johnson." Her partner nodded, adding, "Thank you for cooperating. It's clear there's nothing wrong here." But then, the woman who had called the police stepped forward again, her voice sharp, filled with frustration. "You're just going to leave it at that? Look at them. Doesn't this seem odd to you?" The female officer's voice turned firm, a protective edge creeping in. "Ma'am, the documents are legitimate. There's no issue here." Darren exhaled, his relief palpable, though his composure never wavered. "I understand the concern," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet strength. "But assumptions like these can do real harm. My daughter doesn't deserve to feel unsafe just because our family doesn't look like what some people expect." Emma, still clutching his leg, added in her small, innocent voice, "I love my daddy. He's the best." Her words, simple and pure, hung in the air, carrying through the stillness of the park. It was as if the very tension in the atmosphere had cracked, splitting open to reveal an uncomfortable silence. The woman faltered, her earlier indignation crumbling into something that looked like regret. Her eyes dropped to the ground, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Around them, the onlookers began to murmur softly. Some glanced at Darren with quiet sympathy, others with the heavy weight of shame. One by one, the crowd turned back to their picnics, their conversations resuming, the spectacle losing its grip. But for Darren, the damage had already been done. His daughter's question, "Are we in trouble?" echoed in his mind, a painful reminder of how fragile their peace could be. As the officers retreated to their patrol cars, the female officer paused before climbing into hers. She offered him a small, final gesture of kindness. "I hope you and your daughter have a good rest of your day," she said. Darren nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but deep down, he knew that the hardest part of the day was still to come. He would have to explain to Emma why all of this had happened. As the patrol cars disappeared down the winding road, Darren noticed how the park's mood had shifted. Conversations resumed, but there was a distinct undercurrent of discomfort. People avoided making eye contact, their unease hanging in the air like a shadow, visible in the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Turning his attention to Emma, Darren knelt to her level. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently, "you okay?" Emma's big blue eyes looked up at him, filled with questions she didn't yet know how to voice. "Why did that lady think we're not family?" she asked, her small hands twisting the fabric of her shirt in confusion. Darren paused, his mind racing for the right words. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different," he explained slowly, "but being different doesn't mean something's wrong. We know we're family, and that's what matters." Emma nodded, her young mind working to understand. Darren wished she didn't have to process such a heavy moment at her age, but he also knew this was part of growing up in a world that didn't always make sense. As they gathered their things, a couple sitting nearby caught Darren's eye. The man stood, hesitated, and then walked over. "Hey," he said awkwardly, his voice laced with apology. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. That was wrong." His wife, standing by his side, added softly, "Your daughter is lucky to have you. You handled that so well." Darren managed a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks. I just hope next time people think twice before assuming the worst." As the crowd began to thin out, a few more passers-by offered quiet smiles and nods of solidarity. Their gestures, though small, held meaning. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded Darren that not everyone saw the world through the same narrow lens. The woman who had made the call remained seated on the bench, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her. Darren briefly considered walking over to her, but he hesitated. The regret was visible in her posture, and any conversation now felt unnecessary. "Daddy," Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" "Of course, sweetheart," Darren replied, gathering their things. He placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the car, feeling the weight of the day but also the quiet strength that came from being her father. As they left the park, Darren resolved not to let the events sour him. Instead, he would use this moment to teach Emma, and perhaps others, that love and understanding could overcome even the deepest biases. The drive home was quiet. Emma stared out the window, lost in thought. Darren glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with the complexity of what had just unfolded. He wondered how to explain something so painful to someone so young. "Emma," he broke the silence, his voice soft, "remember how we talked about kindness? How it's important to treat people with love, even if they don't always do the same." Emma nodded, still lost in thought, gazing at the passing trees. "Like when you said that being nice makes the world better?" "That's right," Darren said. "Today, that lady didn't understand us, and she made a mistake. But we don't have to let her mistake define how we feel about our family." Emma turned to him, her little voice steady. "I love our family. You're my dad, and nobody can change that." Darren smiled, his chest tightening with pride. "And I love you more than anything." Later that evening, as he tucked Emma into bed, she hugged him tightly. "I think that lady needs to learn about kindness too," she said softly. "Maybe she does," Darren replied, brushing a lock of hair from Emma's face. "But what's most important is that you always remember who you are and how much you're loved." As he left her room, Darren reflected on the day. It had been painful, yes, but it had also been an opportunity to teach Emma about the strength of their bond and the power of compassion in the face of ignorance. The next weekend, Darren and Emma returned to the park, their favorite blue blanket in tow. This time, they were met with smiles from familiar faces, some of the same people they had encountered the week before. The world hadn't changed overnight, but the small gestures of kindness reminded Darren that progress, though slow, was still possible. Every act of understanding, every moment of kindness, planted seeds that could grow into something greater. As he watched Emma laugh on the swings, Darren knew those seeds had started with families like theirs.